I'm going to start by I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll talk about the Buildings of England series and give you a sort of background to what the series is and how it evolved. And it's got a very long history that goes back into sort of the 1920s, actually. And then I'll talk about sort of project-based work. I'll focus on a couple of projects where the role of a buildings historian was really sort of crucial, and one's very recent, one's a brand new project that's just surfaced in the last month. So, okay, just a little bit about my background. This is a second career for me. 22 years ago today, I left Messrs Intel in Swindon. Yuck. Hated that. I was a corporate data integration analyst, and dead inside, dead behind the eyes. And I went to Bristol University and studied art history with a whole load of architectural history elements. They then had an architectural historian as a tutor, and I studied with him, and then I went to the Courtauld Institute in London and took my master's in British architectural history between sort of 1600 and 1870 or something like that. So that's my sort of main period of interest. I'm not really a medievalist and I'm not a modernist, but I have to deal with all of it. And I came back to Bristol from the Courtauld with my master's neatly tucked under my arm, and really luckily the tutor who I'd studied under was one of the sort of key figures in architectural history in Britain. I didn't realise when I went there, but he took it upon himself with his, bless him, with his 6 students a year to find us all a job if we wanted one. And so I came back. He was a consulting editor on the Pevsner Buildings of England series. And so in 2001, I started writing a new book, which was this. And this is a sort of offshoot series from the Buildings of England called City Guides. So they're soft back, they're sort of pitched at a more casual audience, if you like. They're under a tenner. And that came out in 2004. And I'd grown up in North Somerset, down in Wells, and so I knew North Somerset very well, and I knew that North Somerset was the most out-of-date volume in the whole Pevsner series. Can I just ask how many of you are aware, or have done more than, let's say how many of you sort of picked up a Buildings of England and actually used it or looked at it for informational purposes? So a few of you, but more of you, I guess, sort of know of the name. How many of you know of the name if I said Buildings of England or Pevsner? Yeah, about half. Good. Okay. And I think it's something you should know about as budding architects. It's part of the deal. So the series was begun, actually the work on it began in 1945 by this German architectural historian called Sir Nicholas Pevsner. And the first one was published in 1951, and between then and 1974 he built up almost single-handed this series of books that covers the whole of the UK. Initially it was England, it's now Buildings of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and the idea is to give a gazetteer of the most significant buildings, and they can be of any age. It can be from sort of prehistoric pillow mounds, there's real sort of archaeological stuff, to Stonehenge, to buildings that are just being built in the centre of Bristol, or wherever you happen to be, and everything in between. So it's the most significant, mainly the good, but also the bad buildings if they're really dominant and they affect an area. They'll get a mention just for being so bad. And it goes by county or by parts of county, where, as with Somerset's a big county, and it includes, for our purposes, Bristol and Bath. And within that, it will give a historic account of a town. So it'll start with a little introduction, and then it'll give you the churches, the public buildings, always in a set order, a description of when they're built, the architects, the main features, why they're interesting. So it sort of covers every town, every village, anything with isolated houses, country houses, historic farmhouses, can be anything. And it's become the definitive guide for architects, for planners, for conservation officers, for anyone involved in historic buildings, for people at Historic England who do the listings. And it's now regarded as the world leader of its type. So this is the guy that started all, very earnest-looking German. He was born in Leipzig in 1902 to a Russian Jewish emigre family, and he was sort of quite a precocious academic. He studied at Leipzig University, wrote a thesis on the Baroque houses, merchant houses of Leipzig, and immediately out of university, the sort of 1920s, as you could do then and you can't do now, he becomes a curator at the art gallery in Dresden at sort of 21, and then he goes on and he teaches at Göttingen University later on, and he starts in the 1920s to get interested both in German modernism and the Bauhaus, but also in English art. And by the time he's at Göttingen in the late 20s, he's teaching a course on the Englishness of English art. And that actually became a title of one of the Reith Lectures later on in his life in the 1950s. He delivered the Reith Lectures under that title in 55, I think. So how does he make this sort of weird move to becoming a British architectural historian? Basically, it's the rise of Nazism. So he's expelled from his post in 1933, and he by this time has contacts, because he's been teaching about English art and architecture particularly, he has contacts here, and some of his contacts get him a job in Birmingham, and then later he moves to Britain, and initially he thinks it's going to be temporary, and he thought that some of the sort of economic policies of Nazism were a good thing, and then obviously the racist angle gets more and more acute, and so by the late 30s it's clear he's never going back to Germany until Nazism is defeated. And in fact both his parents and a lot of his family were killed in a concentration camp. But he escapes with his wife, and he has a couple of children. They live in Hampstead, and he's teaching at Cambridge. And then he meets this guy who's a Bristolian, Sir Alan Lane, who founded Penguin Books in 1937, and he's pictured here. God bless him, he was the chap who took Lady Chatterley's lover into a court of law and tested the obscenity laws, and in 1962, so that's why he's sort of gesturing the languidly and grinning. So Alan Lane is aware of Pevsner. They meet sometime during the war, and probably before the war actually, because I think one of the earliest things Pevsner writes is an outline of European art, and then he writes a book on modernism and Germany for Penguin. So there's some apologies for the dreadful quality of the slide here, but some wit thought it would be great to take a picture of the two of them with some penguins at London Zoo. And after the war, basically another of these things that never happens anymore, Alan Lane says to Pevsner, if you could write something and I would publish it, what would you write? And Pevsner says, I'd write a gazetteer of English architecture. I'd like a guide to the whole country. And this comes out of books like the Baedeker Guides that were German. So that this sort of German love of cataloguing everything really, thank you, was what inspires those books. So this sort of guide existed in Germany, a systematic, by building type, by place, a guide to everything of interest. And that's his idea. And Alan Lane basically says, fine, go ahead, have this old Wolseley car. He gets driven around, and so he's teaching at Cambridge. He's teaching also, I think, at Birkbeck University in London, Birkbeck College, and he basically gets to write these books in the Easter and summer holidays. And this is a picture, this is the front cover of his biography, published fairly recently by Susie Harris. And it's this picture of him with this stack of books. This is these, 2 stacks of Buildings of England volumes. So this is one of the early volumes. This is 1952 North Devon. So you can see it's little, it's a little paperback. It's got some black and white photographs in the middle. And it's grown by 2000s to this. So this is 190 pages, cost 6 shillings, 30 pence. This is 802 pages, cost £35. And really the stunning thing about them is that Pevsner achieved all this in his holidays, basically. So he would have somebody in the county to make notes for him over about perhaps a year, and they would collect sheafs of notes, the earliest listing descriptions, stuff like that. And then he'd come down in the Easter holidays. He'd be driven because he didn't really like driving. He'd get out of his hotel room or pub, wherever he was staying, at 8 in the morning. If his driver was a minute late, that spoilt the morning. He was a bit of a pedant. And they would drive around all day. And I reckon when they were doing North Somerset in 1955, he must have been looking at 10 villages a day. How you do that, I have no idea, because so basically I took 4 years to rewrite this. So in those years, from 1945 to 1974, when he retired, 46 volumes were published, 32 were by him alone, 10 were collaborations, and then right at the end in the 70s, when he's actually getting past retirement age, he allowed 4 volumes to be written by other people. That was a really big deal, having someone else write a whole volume. And this is the quote that is always trotted out: it's the greatest endeavour of popular architectural scholarship in the world, Jonathan Meades wrote in the Times, I believe. So that's a sort of weight to carry around with you when you become the reviser. It's treading in the master's footsteps, really. So when I got to pick up this revision starting in 2004, it hadn't been touched for just on 50 years. It was published in written in 55, published in 1958. With no intervening revisions. That was really unusual, not to have any, not even the typographical, typo errors weren't corrected, nothing. And so I started researching and drafting the rewrite, and they were very generous. They give you sort of carte blanche to say you can keep Pevsner's words, you can dispense with them where they're no longer appropriate, you can keep some of his best quotes as a period piece, or you let his entry stand if it's still good. So it's a weird book where it's got both our names on the front cover, Andrew Foyle and Nicholas Pevsner, and with someone who's been dead since 1983. I guess there aren't many people who publish with a person who's 30 years dead. So this book got reprinted and published in 2011. So what did I have to do? Really, there's a whole range of stuff in revising these books, but part of it was about revising Pevsner's prejudices. He loved international modernism and anything Bauhaus, but by the same token, he despised anything Art Deco because it was sort of cheap and commercial. And it was too new when he was writing, really, to be included. Architectural history was just in its infancy. So, things like vernacular architecture, industrial archaeology, dock gates and stuff like that would not have made it in 1955. In the revision, all of the things like the Brunel parts of the docks, not just the suspension bridge obviously, but things like there's an early iron bridge over the Cumberland Basin end of the harbour. That gets included where Pevsner would not have mentioned it. Obviously, you've got to take out what's been demolished since the last edition and add anything new, and then add detail, and because of the expansion of the size of the books. And it's sort of more concerned about capturing local character, really, in context. I'll just give you a few examples. This is Burtons' store in Weston-super-Mare, designed in 1932 by their house architect Harry Worthington in Manchester. And a whole load of Burtons stores look like this. And they've got this fabulous thing where it's sort of classical, but instead of a classical Ionic or whatever you might get, capital at the top of the column, he converts it into these sort of Art Deco elephant's heads. I mean, I think that's a fab little build, well, fab, quite big building. So that goes in, you know, Pevsner would have walked past and just turned his nose up. It wasn't Bauhaus. Odd things like, as just a random example really, butcher shops tend to have these sort of quite interesting tiled fronts in the 1910s, 20s through to the Second World War, and then that stops. And there are a few of them around. The Devon House is in Frome and the other one is in Wells High Street. And I think they're worth putting in. They're a type that no longer has any currency, and you know, they're interesting. They're becoming historic already. So the definition of what's historically interesting has sort of shortened and timescales collapsed. We're no longer just interested in the, you know, smart Georgian houses in Queen Square, which Pevsner certainly was. And then I'm just going to talk very briefly about new sources for research. So there are things that just weren't available to Pevsner, like dendrochronology. There's been a whole load of national research, e.g. 17th century tomb sculpture in the Bristol area is one of the things that people have done serious work on, and that appears in here. So a lot of the stonemasons of sort of Jacobean tombs in Bristol Cathedral are now known. They just weren't known in the 50s. And then you've got local archives, which are by and large highly valuable and often neglected. And then I'm just going to talk and give you a couple of examples of online resources. And I've actually done a couple of freelance projects recently, commissioned by architects who are working on a couple of Victorian hotels in the New Forest, where they didn't have the money or the time to pay me to go down there and look at them, and I just did a quick and dirty desktop survey entirely based on online work. It's not ideal, but for a building that's not massively important, these weren't highly significant historic buildings, it gave us enough to satisfy the planners that they weren't applying to demolish, and in one case it was total demolition, that they weren't demolishing something hugely significant, and obviously they weren't listed. So, you know, it's the amount that's available online is, you know, has just expanded exponentially in particularly the last 10 years. The ICBS is the Incorporated Church Building Society, and they have a huge archive at Lambeth Palace Library of alterations to 19th century churches. It was called Church Plans Online. I put question marks after it because I searched for it this morning and the entire site has disappeared. So having somebody paid a large amount of money to digitise this archive, put it online, I used it incredibly intensively in revising these books, and it's now gone. There's a corpus of Romanesque sculpture if I need to know about Norman arches, like the arch next to the Central Reference Library. And there's a fabulous thing called Britain from Above, which is Historic England, a website based on, I'll explain what Britain from Above is. Okay, so this is a tithe barn out near Shepton Mallet, a little place called Dalting, and Pevsner says this is 15th century, and I just want you to look at that little motif there, because that's a telltale of something very, very much not 15th century. I looked at that and I thought, that's what appears in church tracery in about 1290. And there it is in close-up on the right, with an example of the sort of shape, the same shape in a church window. And that's sort of really characteristic, 1290 to 1310. After that, you don't really see it. And then I find that someone has dendro-dated the roof timbers of this tithe barn at 1288 to 1290. Perfect. So it's 150 years earlier than Pevsner thought it was. So there's a sort of huge revision. Just, it's lovely to have I like some firm evidence for things, and it's great to be able to say, we know that roof is 1288. That keeps me happy. Wells Town Hall, very familiar to me. I'd always assumed this was just Georgian. This is 1777. And, you know, fine, it's a Georgian building. And then I realised that actually it was a flat front originally. It looked like that, but it was flat. The centre didn't project. And that happens in 1861. They push the centre out so they can enlarge the upstairs sort of meeting room. And there's the plan that I found, which is in the Wells City Archive, one of these local archives that's really neglected. And if you look at that, you'll see what isn't on there is there's a balcony on the centre front of the first floor, and above those 3 central windows there are portholes. And none of that was there in 1861, so that's actually added in 1932. So what appears to be a sort of standard Georgian building, you think ho-hum, actually has sort of 3 phases of alteration going on. This is a church I know all about. So incorporating new research, this is where I sang in the choir as a child, and it became my master's dissertation subject. So I researched this, and this is a fabulous illustration from Building News in 1859. And it was one of those Victorian churches that Pevsner he just about mentions it, but it's not really given much of a showing. And actually this is it now. It's entirely intact, almost entirely. There's just that reading desk there has gone. Everything else is essentially intact, all the furnishings. And we now know that the glass is by a Newcastle maker called William Wales, for instance. Who would have thought that Newcastle glass comes down to Somerset? You know, why? I don't know. But being able to name the makers and the craftsmen who contributed to these buildings is, you know, a huge benefit. So you can give a much fuller account. And this is an example of how online resources can be really useful. This is Wells Marketplace, sort of 1900, 1910-ish photo on the left and a present day on the right. And what you can see is things like this little turret and these, they've all got, you can just about see that, they've got battlements now, and that wasn't there. So there's been this sort of subtle change and recreation of medieval, apparently medieval features. And I was sort of just very interested. It's not a great building, but this one, which becomes that. Not a great building, but it's just a good example of how I'd never been able to date this building. I knew it had been reduced from 3 stories to 2, and sometime between the wars, but I didn't know when. And in Britain from Above, which is this sort of compilation online of Historic England's archive of aerial flights, going from about 1920 to 1950, and there were flights over Wells all the time because they're photographing the cathedral, and they keep capturing views of the marketplace while they're at it. These are zoomable to some amazing extent. You can go right in on detail. And I suddenly found this. In May 1933, this building's got scaffolding on it. By July 1934, which is the next available flight, it's in its present form. So suddenly, and that's not, as I said, that's not an important example as a building, but it's just a good example of how online resources can suddenly go, oh, I can date this. I say, you know, this is done in 1933-4. It relies on having flights of the right date. There isn't another one until 1947 over Wells, so I was lucky to get 2 flights that pin that building down precisely. But there's a whole, I just want you to be aware there's a whole load of stuff out there that you can use when you're looking at the background and the history and the context of a site, because it is something that any of you become architects, it's something you're going to have to do, or get someone like me to do it for you. Okay, so that's all what I want to say about revising the Pevsner. And the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've worked on in the last couple of years. So I get employed freelance and typically by conservation architects. A lot of my work has come through a firm called Donald Insall, who are an international company, but they have offices in Bath as well as London and elsewhere. They are a firm of some reputation. They are, when Nelson's Column needed cleaning and repair, it's Donald Insall, House of Lords, all of this sort of, God knows how many, £350 million or whatever it's supposed to cost to conserve and repair the House of Lords. That will be Donald Insall because they've got essentially they have the contract to look after the House of Lords. So they masterminded the restoration of Windsor Castle after the fire. And in 2014, a businessman bought this house in Wiltshire, Stockton House. Chap who made a lot of money online, and he sold his business for 120 million quid. Lucky him. And I loved it. He was a really good client to work for, and he would say his most endearing thing, he's about late 30s then, and he said, of course, he said, what you've got to remember with this house is that I'm a first-time buyer. So this is sort of 6-7 million quid in country life, it's one of those country houses with a real history, and he's a first-time buyer, lucky him. So the house needs major overhaul. It hasn't really been had a significant repair of all the services, installing new security, fire, electrical, water systems, all of it. So we essentially over 3 years pulled the house apart, or Donald Insall's architects did, and I got engaged as the architectural historian and buildings historian to research this and inform the repairs. This is it from the air. And it's been written up 3 times in country life, 1905, sometime in the 70s, and then I think about 1983. And it's always referred to as sort of a fine, untouched specimen, of Elizabethan architecture, blah, 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 blah. Actually, the real story is far more complicated than that. And I'll just show you some of the sort of findings and investigations that we had to do to make any sense of this building. So what you've got, this is a west-facing entrance with this courtyard in front. This is a 17th century addition, which was a chapel. This is early 19th century stable courtyard. Then in the 1870s, they added on this water tower and the wing behind, that little bit that you can just see the end of. And in fact, there was another huge piece of service wing. This was an architect called Benjamin Ferry rehashing and making the service quarters bigger. And then that was demolished in the 1950s. So actually, already you can sort of see that there's more to it than just an untouched building of 1600-ish. This is it in plan. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. This actually belongs out here. They've just collapsed it in for space saving, but if you imagine that wall being parallel with this and the stable block coming down there. So that's the main block of the house, and it's rectangular and it looks all of a piece, and when you walk around the outside you think fine, this is a house of around 1600. It was built, I'll keep that, I think I've got that later. I'll just give you a little tour. So this is the entrance, big drive, sort of a couple of 100 acres of ground around it. This is the south front, so round to the right side from the entrance. And then a southeast view showing this servants' wing. That's that bit with the water tower behind it. So this is all added on in the 1870s through to the early 1880s. The pond, we realised eventually, was the house was requisitioned during the war for American Army They had lots of temporary hutments in the park, and they built themselves a swimming pool. Why not? So this is the swimming pool that had been then converted back into a more picturesque pond later, and then you can just see the how the water tower dominates from the north side. This is the interior of the chapel, which I didn't even really believe might have been a chapel. I really wasn't convinced. It doesn't particularly look chapel-y. We weren't sure why they had a chapel. And what we found with this house, there was almost no archival evidence. So I do all the usual things. I go to Wiltshire Record Office, start looking for documents and maps. The earliest plan I found of the room layout of the house was 1950 in a sale catalogue. There's nothing, I've never found anything earlier than that saying how the rooms were used. And in fact, about the earliest archival evidence I found was in Wiltshire Record Office, and it was this letter from somebody who leased the house in the 1770s, and he says, here somewhere, let's see if I can read it, blah, 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 about not paying any taxes other than the window tax and the tithe, and then he says, there must be also a condition for Mr. Biggs, who was the owner that he was leasing it from, to fit up the old chapel into a 5 or 6 stall stable as he likes best, and finish it by midsummer next, as else it will not be fit for my horses when taken up from grass. And that's the only reference I've actually found to it being a chapel, but then I believed it. So I thought if they called it the old chapel in 1773 and it's built in 16 whatever, maybe 50s, 70s, then it was a chapel. That's recent enough history for them to be accurate. So just a very brief tour of the interior. Horrible ceilings that were changed in the 1920s. This is how it was when the previous owner was moving out. I've not got any, deliberately not shown any pictures of the current owner's rearrangement of the house, just because of his privacy, really. So some fab rooms. I mean, the plaster work and these chimney pieces are really special. This is the sort of small parlour at the south-east corner of the house. This is the first floor room. This is the higher status room, and there's good evidence that this chimney piece actually is extremely similar to one at Montacute House in South Somerset, and was probably by the same stonemason who had also designed Longleat. But you can see how high status this house is, and it was built by basically a couple called John and Mary Topp, who the Topps were farmers in this valley in Wiltshire, and they made good, really. They moved from farming into dealing in wool and dealing in cloth, and he becomes a wool merchant in the city of London by about 1590, and in 1595 they come back to Stockton and they build this house. The stairs have been altered. This is an early 19th century alteration. They took out the original sort of Elizabethan oak, probably oak staircase, and put in this very acrobatic, structurally quite daring staircase. So you can see it goes up into, so I'll do it like this. I'll be channeling EasyJet air stewards here. So it goes up in 2 flights like that to the middle, then it bridges the centre, so it goes up like that, and then it splits again and it goes up the other wall like that. So there's actually 4 different ways you can go up the stairs. All of the structure of this is timber, and it was bouncing to an alarming extent as people came into the house at the sale time and started moving around. We, architects and people like me walking around, and the staircase was sort of doing this if there was more than 2 people going up it. So there was a major task to strengthen the staircase. This is it from the top. And Wyatville apparently says this is one of his, he thought it was his best small staircase. Wyatville later worked on Windsor Castle for George IV, but he'd also worked at Longleat at exactly the same time. So this is the lantern at the top of the stairs at Stockton, and on the right with this horrible green paint is the main staircase at Longleat, which he sort of completely redesigned the stairs and put this new stair in. And if you look at how that dome works and how he's sprung an octagonal lantern off this sort of dome with these little triangular things, you can see exactly the same here. So we're very sure that this lantern was added by Wyatville. It was previously thought to be later. This is the sort of phasing of the main part of the house. So it starts as an L-shaped house. This is the entrance here in about 1596. Great chamber is over the hall there. There's the white parlour. And by quite early on, certainly before 1617, when Mary Top died, they'd added to the house. We know it had 2 kitchens, and I won't bore you with the historical reasons why houses wanted 2 kitchens. Basically, one's a working kitchen and one's for the upper servants. So the winter parlour was still recorded in the 19th century as the steward's room. So he was the estate manager. So it becomes like somewhere that the upper servants can eat. So they had this thing where they wanted 2 kitchens, and so they extended the house into a rectangle. And the clue to that really is this front. So this is we're looking along this east front, along that wall. So right in the middle of that wall, there's going to be a join. And if you look just to the right of the double downpipes, right down there, you can see particularly here, there's a masonry join. And if you look at that, I think you can see that the 2, where the roof ridges meet round that chimney, they're not level. So that's sort of from the middle of the roof, climbing out from the lantern. And I've highlighted the difference in everything of the second phase, that addition, to fill in the rectangle. Everything slopes down, the whole roof slopes down for some reason. So it becomes really clear. You're just pulling apart the archaeology, and that's all you're left with. If you've got no archival evidence, all you can do is read the building, and the building is its own evidence. So it's treating the building as another source. Here's a close-up of that masonry join. As you can see really clearly, that something's happening there. And this string course, which goes right along the above the ground floor windows, suddenly stops. Why they didn't carry it on, I've got no idea, because they do carry on the first floor string course, but they just sort of stopped there. So there's these bits of evidence, you start thinking, what's happened? And actually what had happened was they'd filled in this corner to turn the L shape into a regular rectangle. And if you're talking about an untouched house, this is what we finally came up with. By 1879, there are 6 phases of work. And the last phase is the building. That's the water tower, and that's the bit behind it. And by 1951, they demolished that bit of wing up there, and that pretty much leaves the house as it is today. So there are 7 phases of work in this building. It's not an untouched building in any sense. There's the scars where they removed the kitchen wing. You see that sort of white brickwork around the water tower. Elizabethan Room, this is one of the rooms that's really praised and talked about, has got the arms of James I, which puts it after 1603 in the overmantel, but on the ceiling, the arms of Elizabeth I. For some reason, they've reversed the initials. I don't know why. And this has been, cited in Pevsner and elsewhere as a fine, example of Elizabethan plasterwork, Jacobean plasterwork, except that when we took up the floor, which is all of the 1870s, pine floors, you find the whole underfloor was littered with this plasterwork which matched the pattern of the ceiling. So actually, either parts or probably all of that ceiling has come down, and it's after 1879. We think it's a a faithful recreation of what was there before, but who knows. So the plot thickens, it just became a minefield really of trying to unravel this house. Here's under the hall floor. Very little underfloor structure gave any evidence of what you would think was early stuff to sort of match the date of the house. And so this is a great big oak floor joist. These are oak. You can see that these joists have been cut. They're not sort of square and neat like this one. This has been cut with a steam saw, a machine-driven saw. These are cut by axe. So this main supporting joist has completely rotted away about a foot and a half short of the wall. And what they'd done in its place in the 1870s was add all of this ironwork, sort of brackets and braces and then plates under the floor to put a new floor on top of it to give it a sort of a structure. So, and in fact that amazing ceiling in the great chamber, the most elaborate room that I showed you, all of that above is held up by this 1870s ironwork. So it's, the story is not a simple one. That's all I'm trying to tell you, really. Yeah, I don't think there's anything more I have to say about that. So the second project, and I haven't got very much more time, is a much shorter one. This is a project that I knew nothing about until the end of January, and suddenly this landed on my desk for a different architect, and it's complete opposite, and it's just an object lesson in how useful archival resources can be if they're there very early on. So Stockton's all about reading the structure in the absence of any other evidence. And in the end, the structure of a building is always the best evidence for what's happened to it. You can't deny if there's ironwork under that floor, you sure as hell ain't 17th century. It can't lie. We knew straight away that was 19th century ironwork. It just has all the right hallmarks, and all the floors are deal and machine cut, and you can see the marks of machine circular saws. You can't deny it. So this is I'm deliberately not saying where this is because it's still commercially sensitive. If any of you might recognise it, I don't know, but I'm not going to name it. But it's near Bristol, and essentially this is what got built. Is this Palladian Villa of 1735, and this is an illustration that's at the British Library. And I knew about this illustration already before I got commissioned to work on this. And then there are about 3 or 4 books on this house, and they all say that it's on the site of an earlier house. But nothing really was known about this earlier house. And I was quite sceptical about how close it actually was. Was it just on the same estate within half a mile? Who knew? Is it right underneath this house? But what you can see here is a sort of typical early Georgian, centre block with this Palladio 131 bay structure. Yeah, 131. And then little corridor links to these pavilions. Very nicely done. And this essentially is all still there. The building became a school, and this is it in 1932. But you can see already that this is not 131, there's an extra bay of windows on each end, and we've already found that these were added in 1747, so about 10 years after. They just wanted to enlarge the 2 side rooms, so they expand them by a bay, and the invoices for these survive. And I couldn't work out, it said for 4 windows, and there are 2 windows round on the side, so I'm thinking why that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on each side. So there should be 12 windows. Why are there only 4 on the invoices? And I realised that, of course, they took down the side walls and pushed everything out, but they don't throw away that stonework. They're very good at reusing. So they just expand the front, put on the 4 windows that are needed on the front, and the side windows, 4 on each side, get rebuilt in the new wall, and that's why there's only 4. Duh. It dawned on me, I was looking around the building the other day, and I thought, oh, of course, they didn't need to make new windows. These windows were only 10 years old, so they just reused the stonework. The school has this embarrassing wealth of its own archive of the buildings. Almost every plan since 1890s. The building became a school in 1885, and they've kept almost every plan or something of every phase of building since then. And here you can see sort of bundles of plans relating to a sports hall that was added in the 60s, blah, blah, blah. But just brilliant stuff in there. So this is a plan of the house in the 1880s, just before it becomes a school. And here you can see the main block with its staircase in front, little corridors, 2 pavilion wings, little bits with the domed tops. And, oh, sorry. And over here, which is now gone under the sports hall, is a sort of service courtyard, I guess. This would have been a kitchen and some ancillary stuff like wood sheds and things like that inside a little walled courtyard. Entrance comes in there, still does, and this was the stables, and you can see it's got this U shape. There's this little funny little tiny courtyard at the back of the stables. That's really important because we realised from some of the books that when they built an assembly hall on this site, so a lot of this ground is now covered with school buildings, and they built an assembly hall here, and the structure of the stables is buried inside it. So there's still 2 walls of the stables in existence. They're just part of the assembly hall, and that's really important because it enables us to place where those stables are on today's map. And then we found this, and this has all happened in the last 2 weeks. So it's the complete opposite of Stockton. This is another British Library thing. I apologise for the quality of this. I just found this as literally an A4 photocopy in the school archives, and I was hoping to get I'm getting the original photographed at the British Library as we speak, but it hasn't come through yet. So this is a poor quality scan of the photocopy. But what it shows you is A is at the bottom. So this is 1732. This is the year that the owner buys the estate and builds the new house, which they move into in 1735. So the first thing he must have done was had a plan of the estate made, and it shows the Elizabethan house that was on the site, looking a little bit like Stockton. And there it is, L-shaped house, and right behind it is that, which is the stables. So that's it in ridiculous level of zoom. And you can see the stable, and you know it's the same thing because it's got that little courtyard and this sort of fat U shape going on. So I just mapped that onto the 1880s version of the stables, and you get that, and that's where the Elizabethan house sits. So already we know that if we come to discuss what's going to be happening on this part of the site, any work that gets done there, they're likely to come across Elizabethan foundations, and that is brilliant to know at this stage because it saves money basically. If they know now that they've got to build into the budgets for some archaeological investigation and into the timescales, that's great. What you don't want to do is be halfway through building and somebody come across this and realise that the whole thing stops for 3 months while they do archaeology on it. That's where your timescale goes down the chute. So just sort of 2 weeks' work on this house has revealed stuff that was just not known before. Nobody put this British Library estate map together with the plan of the current house. And so, as far as I can see, no one's ever established before what the site of the Elizabethan house exactly was. And it actually, see, half of it goes out. This is now a public road with houses on it, and half of it is underneath the road, so that half we don't have to worry about. So why bother with buildings history? Partly it's about conservation, it's this sort of green ethos, it's about reuse. So there's more and more reuse of existing buildings, and that means that somebody has to understand what those buildings are and what's happened to them. Even if they're not architecturally significant, you have to know what the heck's happened here. Otherwise, you know, you're struggling with structural issues and you know, what you might find when you take up a floor. And then there's sort of some much more, I suppose, important considerations, which is things like the fact that the preservation of history is a sort of social significance now, that people regard their environment and historic buildings in the environment as something that gives it local character and identity, and they want those buildings kept. And there's always that tension between demolition and rebuilding and keeping old buildings, and I've got involved in those battles in Bristol before, and some you win and some you lose. But you need to be able to unravel a building's past in order to decide what's appropriate now. And as I said, it's identifying issues up front can be a huge money saver. To be able to plan for the Elizabethan foundations you might find is just, you know, a real advantage when you're in this early stage of planning. But the overall message is buildings are their own evidence. Buildings sort of act as, if you like, the footprint of what's happened in the past. So the ultimate arbiter of what's happened to a building for me is always that archaeological evidence that we were looking at Stockton, and that's sort of what I've devoted the last 10 years of my career to, and I love doing it. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and thank you very much.